2 weeks ago, I set out to add a new farming system to my fantasy sheep herding farming game, and I went way off the rails and did something crazy instead. Hello and welcome to my running series of devlog updates on Ewe Shall Not Pass, a game where you play as Shmandalf the wizard and grow a flock, herding your sheep to safety through lands unknown before resting and managing your ever-growing farm. In my last devlog, I told you that the following 2 weeks were going to be dedicated to adding a new farming system to the game. I had plans to add a sheep variant system and sheep breeding system to the game so that you could play a hand in the growth of your flock. Well, I have some good news and I have some bad news. The bad news is there isn't a single sheep variant to be found. Not one. There's no sheep breeding, no variants. We're still at square one. The good news is I did something else instead. Something pretty crazy. I released the game. Yes. You heard me right. I released the game in early access. It's not full release, but you can go on Steam and play this game if you so choose. Because it is on Steam now. This very moment, it is on Steam. You can play it. Let's go. So, that's quite the turn of events from adding new sheep to the game to releasing the game. So what happened? What the heck happened in the past 2 weeks? I'll start by explaining why I released in early access. There are 3 main reasons. The first reason, I needed playtesting feedback, and I still do. As the developer, I am too close to the game to be able to playtest myself and find good bugs, know what mechanics are working well and what are not, know where the game lulls and where it feels good. I'm just a little too close to be able to see the forest through the trees, and I need other people to play it to get the feedback on how to make the game stronger, which is all that good feedback you get when someone else plays the game. Good feedback, bad feedback, it's all very helpful to me as the developer. So why didn't I just have a friend or a family member give me all that playtesting feedback? Why would I release it to get that feedback? That goes into reason number 2. I wanted feedback from you. If you watch my videos and you leave a comment about something you want to see implemented in the game, or a mechanic that feels dry, or a change that you want to see made, I wanted you to be able to experience that change. I think it's cool to be able to comment something and see me make that change, but I think it's something else entirely to be able to play that change. Part of my ethos as a game developer, I don't know if that's the right word actually. Part of what I want to do as a game developer is include you in the development of the game. As a solo developer, I really value the opportunity to get to work with you, the player, and I figured if the game is playable and I'm just adding new features, I should let you be able to experience that. And now, reason number 3. I needed to release this game for my own mental well-being. I was at a sort of breaking point with this game, a year in development, and I needed to cross some kind of threshold to add a little bit of wind to my sails. Video game development is a long process with little external validation. Making a game takes months, years before anyone sees it, and you have to stay motivated during that entire time. I felt like I was getting to the end of my rope, so to stay motivated and add some momentum, I decided the game is in a good enough place for people to try out. Let's get it out there. And it really has helped, with a few exceptions. So what did that release look like, and what are those exceptions? Okay, I feel a little vulnerable talking about it. I feel a tad bit overwhelmed in this process. The game was broken on launch. I know, why would you release a broken game? I didn't know it was broken. You could play for a while, about 20 minutes, and then the game would crash unexpectedly during specific regions. When I went to find the bug, my Unity editor would crash, meaning I couldn't get any debug information. Luckily, I have a ton of siblings that were willing to play the game when I launched it, and together on Discord, we honed in on what we think the issue is. The moment a spell orb or a fireball is about to collide with an enemy. Most of the time, there is no issue. This collision goes off without a hitch, the enemy is hit, they die, whatever, check, good to go. But sometimes, and only sometimes, the moment they're about to collide, the game crashes. My Unity editor crashes. I have scoured my code, and none of it looks bad. None of it looks game-crashing dangerous, which leads me to believe there's an issue with Unity's on-collision enter 2D method. I could be wrong, but I don't get to look at Unity's code. I have gotten rid of just about all my own code, and the only thing that I can confirm is that the on-collision enter 2D method occasionally crashes the editor and the game. Because I think it's an issue with Unity, I feel pretty helpless and pretty powerless in fixing this bug. I could change all of my methods to on-trigger enter 2D, or raycast, or replace all my collision enter 2D methods with something else, but that would be a lot of work, and I don't really know what that looks like yet. I am still grappling with this, and I'm looking for solutions, and I am actively trying to fix this game crashing bug. I thought I had fixed it a few days ago. I thought it was an issue with batching layer changes in Unity. It was not the issue. It occurred again yesterday, and it makes me really sad, and I feel so powerless, but I'm working on it. I am. It doesn't happen all the time. You could probably play the game for about 30 minutes before it happens, and then when it happens, you could just reboot the game and keep playing for another 30 minutes. I save a lot of data as you go, so most of your progress will remain. The game just closes, which is annoying. There were some other bugs when I released. Nothing game crashing, but some game ruining, mostly with UI not populating correctly. But those have since been patched. I did make some pretty substantial changes before I launched the game, so if you've been following along, you might not recognize the game entirely. About a week before I released the game, I had my little brothers play and give me some feedback, and the feedback I got was game-changing. Based on the feedback, there were two major bottlenecks that were stopping the game from being a fun experience. One was a big change I had to make at the farm, and one was a big change I had to make in the combat regions. The problem at the farm was that the process of buying spells was overwhelming and there was no thread for the player to follow. I gave the player access to all the spells off the bat, and it was up to them to choose which ones they wanted to save for, which, as a first-time player, is way too overwhelming. To fix this, I added a new scene and a new system of unlocking spells that I am calling the library, which will be the focus of this segment of Peek Under the Hood. Whenever I start a new system or a new scene, I find it's always best to take some time and plan it out. That, for me, means going to a coffee shop with a sketchbook and taking notes, drawing, diagramming, until I feel like I have a thorough understanding of what it is I'm trying to do. I wanted spells to be unlocked over time based on the amount of levels the player has completed, putting players on a fixed track and making it much clearer what the player's objectives are. I decided to move away from the spell books, and I replaced those with crystal balls to elevate the sense of magic and add a little bit more grandeur to the process. I split the spells between combat spells and farming spells so that the player still had some amount of choice about which track to invest in. I whipped up a scene with some blank assets and created a slider that would display how many levels the player has completed versus how many levels they need to unlock the highest level spell. I added some stand-in buttons where the crystal balls would go that, when clicked, would open a description of the spell, show you how much it cost, and would open a button for you to purchase it if you met the criteria. This is the script that controls the library UI. I grab references to all the transforms and text elements, images and animators. I have a few integer values to keep track of, and I grab all those references in my awake function. I grab the total number of levels that the player has played, which is then represented in the slider, so I call this assign slider value method. The slider represents a percent value between 0 and 1, which is the total number of levels the player has played over the range of the slider. I start the slider at 0, dynamic levels played starts at 0, and I start the text at 0, and then I start a coroutine called slider juice, which just makes it feel a little cooler when you open the scene, that over a few seconds will slide the value to its appropriate value, shown here. Nice. Just a little juicier than if you open the scene and it was already assigned. When you press on one of the spell buttons, it will call a method controlled by the library spell slot script, and when you click the button, it will call this method select slot, which will call a method in the library UI. So when you open the spell description, I like to close everything. It basically sets all of the strings to 0, resets everything. I grab that index of the button, I set the description to true, and I call this method assign spell description. So this is a little bit of a beefy method, nothing crazy, but a little beefier. So I grab a reference to the slot based on the index here, and in that slot I store an enum spell shown here. We have public spell. And this is just an enum with all the different spells you can unlock in the game. I set the title equal to the name of that spell, which I have a method called sentences, which I'm hoping to use for localization, where I keep track of all of the text that the player will see in the game. That way I can put all of this in a document, get that document translated, and then have methods in this one script that can change the language based on player settings. That is something I am currently working on. I set the description to the description of that spell, the cost to the price of that spell. This is another types document. It looks the same as the sentences, but keeps track of prices of things. I basically have a lot of scripts that keep track of data so that if I can change it one time in this document and it'll change it everywhere, because I have found that putting in strings just as strings can be a nightmare if you end up changing things, and I often end up changing things. I set buttons to active, I set text active, and set it to the right strings, and then based on whether or not the player is using that spell, I will trigger certain animations. I will lock the button if it's locked, and I'll change the color if it's locked to show that. If you scroll through them, all I have to do is change that spell index and then call the exact same method, assign spell description, which grabs a reference based on the index. If you select purchase, this is how I keep track of if you can purchase it. If the button says purchase, you can buy it. If it does not, then return. That is the only action that can be triggered with the button. If you try to click it but you don't have enough money, I would like to play some sound, give the player some feedback. I haven't found that sound yet, so right now this is just empty. Same here, I would like to play a sound. I don't have that yet, so this is currently just a comment. But then I call this by spell method, which keeps track of all of the player spells. I take the amount of money out of the player inventory only if they have that. If they don't have that, I call this event spell purchased, and I recall assign spell description because now the state of that button has changed, so instead of saying purchase, it will say in use, active. Now that the scene was rigged, I needed to create some assets. I created 3 different crystal ball assets, one for when a spell was locked, one for when it was unlocked, and one for when it was purchased and in use. I added a background, which was shelving, and a little bit of lighting. I animated the crystal ball when it is unlocked. I would like to animate the other 2 as well, but there is so much to do. I can really only tackle the things I'm like, that needs to happen, and the unlocked crystal ball needed a little bit more juice to draw the player's attention so they would know, ooh, this one's unlocked, let's click it. Ooh, should I buy it, should I not? With the art and the code complete, I had to slide this scene into my game build and change my scene navigation script to direct the player to this scene. I decided I wanted a physical representation of this place in the farm scene, so I split up the barn where you would go and shear your sheep into 2 different assets. I took the barn and I made that a separate area, and I made the house a house. So now when you interact with the house, you go to the library, and when you interact with the barn, you go to the herd scene. That was this section of Peek Under the Hood. If you want me to go into more detail, let me know. I'm keeping it kind of loose at the moment because that's what I know how to do. But I told you there were 2 things that needed fixing. That was the farm issue. The second issue was an issue with combat. The combat was too repetitive, and it felt like a chore that you had to do to progress your farm. My little brothers recommended that when you start combat, the player is given pretty dramatic shifts in gameplay. Instead of giving the player just 1 power-up when they start a run-through, I decided to give them a starter deck that would significantly change how they play. Starter decks include the warrior deck, which gives you higher speed, immunity to stun, and the ability to kill enemies if you run into them. The archer deck, which gives you an increased reload and honing projectiles. There are decks for each spell, and I'm hoping to add more and more decks as I add more and more power-ups. I think this fixed the problem, but I think I can push it even further, and I'm hoping to do so in the coming weeks. Once I made those 2 changes, I pushed go and released the game. And I'll admit, that night, after I pushed go, I felt so tired and so overwhelmed and so vulnerable that I just had to go to bed early and not think about it until the morning. It is difficult to put yourself out there. If you're in a similar situation, just remember to breathe and take it one step at a time. So what's next on my plate now that this game is out there? I would love to complete a challenge over the next 2 weeks, but I imagine I will largely be patching bugs as feedback comes in and trying to track down this one game-crashing bug that I don't think is my fault, but I will keep looking. Other major updates I have on the books are an inventory and crafting system, a sheep variant and sheep breeding system, adding lots of content to the farm, and one update that I am calling the Juice Update, where I make all the lackluster parts of the game feel a little bit more juicy. I'll add camera work and lighting and animations, but those take a while, so I imagine that will be an entire update, is the Juice Update. If there's anything you want to see, leave a comment. If you're curious about this game, go play it! I implore you, go play the game. It is in early access, so there will be a few bugs, but it's only $5. It's basically buying me a coffee and then you get a game. Cool. If you do play, I so appreciate any comments you have. Good, bad, all of it. Let me know. I read it, I see it, and I do my best to address it. The game is available on PC and on Mac. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like and a comment. It really bolsters my will to live. And until I see you next, happy gaming.